A very warm welcome to everybody this evening. I'm Peter Danchin, Associate Dean for Research and Faculty Development here at the Law School. It really is fantastic to see so many students, alumni, staff, and faculty able to join us this evening for the next in our series of faculty webinars, which tonight is a conversation on what's next, the consequences of the election for both domestic and international law. And so let me just make a few opening comments before introducing our speakers. Of course, the national election last week has been one of the most closely watched in recent history, not only here in the United States, but also around the world. A record number of Americans have voted, over 149 million people, and still counting. While the outcome has not yet officially been confirmed, a Biden administration now appears a near certainty. What we do know is that both the election itself and its outcome will have far-reaching consequences for both domestic and international law and policy of the United States. For the last 4 years, the current administration has pursued policies of aggressive tax and regulatory cuts, withdrawal from international treaty regimes and institutions, and I guess what we can characterize as a decentralized unilateral approach to the global COVID-19 pandemic. Joseph Biden, as candidate for president, has campaigned to raise taxes on both corporations and individuals with income over $400,000, to return the United States to leadership positions and treaty commitments in international law, and to impose aggressive federal intervention in the COVID-19 crisis. So to help us understand and reflect critically on these complex questions, in what I really think are three key areas of tax and economic policy, the COVID-19 pandemic, and international law and foreign policy, we're joined by three members of our faculty who will offer their thoughts on three issues that I'm going to raise with them. The first, what has just transpired in the election. Second, the likely consequences and impact of a Biden administration in the two domains of national and international law. And thirdly, what we see as the obstacles and challenges that lie ahead. So let me introduce our three speakers. First is Professor Dan Goldberg, who's an authority on tax law and policy and law and economics, and who teaches courses in income taxation, various aspects of business taxation, both partnership and corporate, tax policy, and international tax as well. Second is Professor Matiangai Sirleaf, who has just joined the Maryland faculty as the Nathan Patz Professor of Law, and who is an authority, writes and researches and teaches in the areas of global public health, international law and human rights, criminal law, and post-conflict and transitional justice. And third is Professor Maxwell Chibundu, who is an authority on international law and the rule of law in economic and political transformation, and who teaches courses here at the law school in civil procedure, international business transactions, comparative jurisprudence, and conflict of laws. So a warm welcome to each of our three speakers. What we're going to do for the format this evening is to have a bit of a question and answer on these different themes, and then to have some exchanges with all of you in the audience. So let me begin the conversation this evening with the question of the election itself and how we view what has just transpired over recent weeks. So Professor Goldberg, if I could start with you, one of the central questions in the election really was tax and economic policy. Could you outline for us to begin our discussion what the key differences were between the candidates and how those differences unfolded in the course of both the campaigns and the election? And importantly, as part of that, to what extent the COVID-19 pandemic really influenced both the trajectory and outcome of these debates?
Well, thank you, Peter. Let me preface my remarks by saying that the pre-election campaigning was not particularly substantive, but rather was very personal in tone. President Trump emphasized in his unique way, and you can take that aside any way you want to, the great things that he's done: tax cuts, making American business more competitive, pre-pandemic the pre-pandemic rising tide floated all boats across all ethnic groups, spurring vaccine and therapeutic drug development early in the COVID crisis, and how President-elect Biden would be deficient as a president. President Biden did not say very much, apart from that he would emphasize getting through the pandemic as a priority and would undo the Trump tax reductions and thereby tax rich and high-income people more than currently as a matter of fairness. Most of what I gleaned regarding the likely details of their, particularly President-elect Biden's post-election plans, comes from articles that I've read about what the Biden approach to taxation and tax changes would be, which I'll talk about a bit later and when we get into details.
Terrific, thank you. So staying on the theme of the pandemic, if I can turn to you, Professor Sirleaf, let me ask you first about what you see as the real impact of the pandemic on the election itself. Of course, the many issues around voting by mail and the disputes that are continuing to unfold from that and legal challenges, but also in terms of each of the candidates' approaches to the pandemic. You know, what has really been the effects of these different approaches in terms of addressing what is a rapidly still escalating infection rate and spread of the COVID-19 pandemic?
Thanks for that, Peter. I think it's prescient that we're meeting today remotely to talk about this because the COVID-19 pandemic has had an impact on all of our lives, not just the election. And so one of the things that was an obvious impact of the pandemic was the increasing number of voters trying to vote by mail in order to decrease risk of contracting COVID-19. And what was frustrating actually really to see was the limits to increased access to voting that were posed by a number of legal challenges. For example, in Harris County, Texas, there was an approval to allow for curbside voting, which would help not only those who are trying to limit potential exposure to COVID-19, but also those who were interested in, those who are disabled, those who for many reasons have mobility issues and are not able to sort of stand in line for hours on end. And there were a number of limits placed around the country on how many sites would be open. There were also limits on how long early voting would be allowed, whether voting by mail in a number of places would be allowed. And so I would have liked to have seen, given the fact that we're in a pandemic, but even outside of that, just a far more robust response to easing access and facilitating access to voting during a pandemic. That said, the number of sort of raw votes is historic, as we know. President-elect Biden has more votes than any other president-elect in history, and President Trump has the second most. That said, the stats for the pandemic only continue to worsen after the election and prior to the election. I just looked at the Johns Hopkins COVID tracker for today, and it shows the United States at over 10,361,000 and 918 cases with 240,000 deaths. Yesterday, the COVID data tracking project indicated that states are reporting 1.2 million tests, 131,000 cases, which is the highest single day total since the pandemic started. There are currently 62,000 people hospitalized with COVID-19. The death toll yesterday was 1,347. And what is scary and frightening is that each day, it seems, the numbers continue to grow and they get higher, such that this country is facing one of the greatest crises that it has seen since probably the Great Depression. And then there's also the challenge of the transition and real questions around whether there will be a peaceful transition of power and whether there will be a concession of the election. And so the COVID-19 pandemic has certainly informed the sort of mechanics of the election, but looking at the exit poll data, which I spent some time reviewing and preparing for this, there were a number of divergences that we saw in terms of the importance placed on the pandemic and handling of the pandemic response, depending on sort of your political leanings. I mean, generally, an NBC exit poll found that 61% of those casting their ballots said that the rising number of COVID cases is a significant factor in their vote, and that this latest surge, or entering the third peak as we are, is something that is really important to them. Only 33% said, this recent spike in COVID is not very important. What was significant in that is that voters who tended or said that they supported Biden were far more likely than President Trump voters to say that coronavirus cases and the rising number of them were important to that vote. So 83% of Biden voters said that, compared with just 46%. And then in the same NBC exit poll showed that there was also sort of a split view on who could better handle the coronavirus pandemic, with about 53% saying Biden and 42% saying President Trump. And so this is striking, given a number of the criticisms that have been leveled against the Trump administration's handling of the pandemic. And I think here there are actually very clear differences between the two administrations and their approach to the pandemic, with President Trump, prior to the election, a number of senior officials in his administration alluding to trying herd immunity as a strategy, which has actually never really been tried in an infection context. Herd immunity is something that you try to do with vaccinations, and you try to get as many people vaccinated as possible, and then achieving immunity through sort of a group immunity through vaccines, but not through an infection pathway. And so that is something that is actually very dangerous, because it exposes many people to illness and actual death. And the Biden administration, which we'll talk about a little bit later, President-elect Biden had a number of plans for dealing with COVID-19 that didn't involve sort of letting the virus sort of run through society and seeing what happens. And so I think there are actually stark differences in how both would handle the pandemic, despite the sort of closeness in terms of who would be the most effective in dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, demonstrated by the exit poll results. So I'll stop there.
Terrific. Thank you very much. So if I could turn to you, Professor Chibundu, one of the other really big issues in this election, looking at it really from the perspective of the international level and international law, was the widely anticipated issue leading up to the election of foreign interference, especially meddling by other states, and in particular by Russia, in what was termed the national sovereignty of the United States. So could you tell us a bit about how this issue unfolded and how we might think about it under contemporary international law, how international law regulates or doesn't regulate the question of meddling in national elections?
Okay, thanks, Peter. Perhaps the more accurate question is how it did not unfold. An article by David Sanger in yesterday's Times says that one of the wonders of these past elections is how little interference occurred. The bigwigs in Fort Meade, which is just down the road and is the headquarters of the National Security Agency, and they're the primary people who deal with cyber stuff. And in the Pentagon, apparently have told David Sanger that they have been surprised by how little intervention there seems to have been. Not apparently, the campaign was, of course, waged against the backdrop of 2016. In 2016, the U.S. intelligence services say that a Russian intelligence unit, the GRU, which is affiliated with the Russian army, hacked computer systems in the US, and that lots of Russian robots or bots, as the computer people commonly call them, were influential in disseminating what has been called misinformation. And that, of course, all resulted in the Mueller report and the Mueller investigation. So over the last 4 years, the question of foreign interference in US domestic elections has been a central feature of politics in this country. I don't know that there's much more to be said on the political side. I want to spend a bit of time on the legal side. So let's assume that there was not de minimis foreign involvement. But I always find it interesting that whenever intervention or foreign interference is muted, you can almost, without reading the article, pick up the usual suspects. And typically there are the suspects with whom there is a fair amount of disagreement. Now that may be logical, it may not be logical, but that's for politicians to worry about. As a legal proposition, and specifically international law, I want to distinguish, and you should distinguish, between interference through the dissemination of information, misinformation, propaganda, call it what you will, on the one hand, and the mechanisms by which such dissemination occurs, such as the use of computer systems, or even the dropping of pamphlets. There can be any number of ways for doing that. And international law, I think, does distinguish and should distinguish them. International law, like many Americans, starts with a proposition that sovereignty belongs to the people of the state, and that there is something untoward with interfering in the exercise of that sovereignty by the people of the state. So international law basically says foreign countries should, as much as possible, refrain from interference. But basically, it's really a particular form of interference with the territorial integrity or political independence of a state, or the threat, and typically interference through the use of force or the threat of the use of force. It might seem rather awkward to say, is dissemination of misinformation really, does it fall within this prohibition? I think it's difficult to make out the argument to the extent that much of international law is framed by the conduct of states. It's particularly difficult because if you go back in history, much of the interference, if that's what it is, has come from those of us in the West, and of course from the East. But it's a fairly common practice. So to some extent, it's perfectly acceptable through repetition, I suppose. The really difficult one is using computers, for example, or cyber warfare to deal with that. I think there's a much closer call. That's a much closer call whether, in fact, international law forbids it. It's fair to say there is no treaty, or there's very little treaty on the point. And in fact, for better or for worse, the US has been central in preventing any attempt at arriving at some sort of international treaty. Now, that's not to say that the other countries would not oppose it if there was some movement towards it, but movement towards it has actually been obstructed in part because the military people here and the government does not think or believes that the US is well ahead in terms of the capacity to engage in cyber warfare, and therefore it's better if it were not regulated. So that's at least worth thinking about. I do not know of any movement there, any serious movement towards regulating using computers or cyber material to interfere with the internal affairs of other countries. And that perhaps is one thing we might want to talk about in the context of what lies in the future.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you very much. So let's move then to the key question for the evening, which is the likely consequences of a Biden administration for both national and international law. So Professor Goldberg, back to you. The three real areas of tax policy where a Biden administration has proposed major changes appear to be in relation to income tax, corporate tax, and the estate tax. So I wonder if you could outline for us and explain what you think these changes would entail and what their likely effects would be, both legally and in terms of the economy.
Sure. Although I have not been in direct or even indirect communication with President-elect Biden or his transition team, I could make some predictions or at least give you my expectations from various articles that have been in the news media, both during the campaign and more recently. Some of what I'm going to suggest may even come from the wishes of his supporters or detractors that found their way into the news media. I'll talk about the ones I think will be most likely and most important. I'm open to questions later regarding the others. So let me divide it the way Peter did into by starting with income taxes. And the big topic heading there is expect raise taxes on taxpayers whose income exceeds $400,000 per year. Now, what is, excuse me, candidate Biden talked about the repeal of the 2017 changes for the top income tax rates, which under the Biden plan presumably will revert back to 39.6% and 37%, essentially affecting taxpayers with incomes above the $400,000 mark. This was a virtual promise during the Biden campaign, so I expect this to be a change, assuming a willing Senate. More about that later. Less likely are several others, including the elimination of the special capital gains tax rates for taxpayers whose ordinary income is in excess of $1 million a year. Changes in the way itemized deductions are treated so that you can only offset itemized deductions to the extent of the way ordinary income is taxed up to 28%. You don't get the full write-off of itemized deductions. Presumably reinstatement of the SALT deduction, the deduction for state and local taxes. It was talked about, never a promise by the Biden candidacy, but candidate Biden was not terribly specific about any of these tax changes other than the 400,000. And some other things like regarding qualified retirement plans and planning and the benefit that one gets from a deductible contribution to, let's say an IRA or a SEP IRA, or the excludable contribution that an employer makes to a qualified retirement plan. The benefits won't be as great as they were currently, as they are currently. Moving to the corporate tax side, the topic heading there is raise corporate tax rates from 21% to 28%, which is part the way back to the old 35% rate for corporations. This change would affect the choice of entity issue, a subject that I've written about and published in an article in the Tax Lawyer, choice of entity for a venture capital startup. and which I teach about in my business planning seminar at the law school. And it would perhaps affect the stock market, a subject that I have not written about, but I believe that the low corporate tax rates gave a boost to. Some of the benefits of the low corporate rate under the Trump administration may have been shared by workers in the form of higher wages and greater employment numbers. So the first big one is the raise in the corporate side, is raising the corporate tax rate from its current historic low of 21%. And the third area affects estates and gifts in a couple of ways. The heading here is it'll reduce the estate and gift tax exemption amount back to where it was before the 2017 tax law, or even less. Now recall that the estate and gift tax exclusion amount was doubled by the 2017 Tax Act, effective 2018, which is now has an effective exclusion amount for 2020 of 11.58 million. So it's between 11 and 12 million of excluded. That's a per person one. So that exclusion is effectively doubled for married couples, taking most, a tremendous number of people who are generally considered wealthy out of the death transfer or the gift and estate tax scope. The exclusion is effectively doubled for married couples. Estates in excess of that amount would be taxed at 40%. Now, the Biden plan would likely undo that doubling of the current exclusion, at the very least, I would think, back to 11.58, maybe plus some inflation. And it's been suggested by some that it might even reduce the basic amount exemption, the basic amount exemption down to 3.5 million per decedent, rather than the 5.79 million per person that individual decedents now have as their exclusion. Now, estate planners that I know are expecting a change in this area and are advising on it and suggesting or recommending to clients that they do something now while the goodies are there rather than wait. It's also been suggested that the Biden plan would eliminate the Section 1014 step up in basis at death, which has been in the code as long as I can remember. That is perhaps since its inception, with a 2-year hiatus between 1978 and 1980, which later retroactively got reinstated. And what that does is it allows an estate and therefore beneficiaries of an estate to take a basis in the decedent's appreciated assets, not equal to the basis that the decedent had, but rather to its fair market value at death. Big benefit for wealthy people. And less likely, however, but as an alternative to a tax on decedents unrealized, is a tax on decedents unrealized gains at death. Less likely, but still possible. And so also a suggested change in payroll taxes, increase in payroll taxes for compensation for earnings. That's payroll taxes, meaning Social Security or self-employment tax for compensation incomes above 400,000. And that would result in a donut hole. So that right now the limit is 137.7, then there'll be nothing, and then there'll be this 12.4% excess additional tax on earnings in excess of 400,000. So where does all this lead us? The prospective changes that I've talked about are not all equally likely. Some involve express promises during the campaign, at least as reported in the press, and some probably involve wishes of some of the campaign supporters. Many will be tempered or even eliminated if the Republicans hold their majority in the Senate. but even the current low tax reduction changes enacted in 2017 expire at the end of 2025. So we're in for some tax discussion and some wrangling in our future years. That's what our future holds.
Terrific, thank you. So if I could move then from tax and economic policy to the central question that I think many of us are thinking about, which is the pandemic. And President-elect Biden has announced the Biden-Harris plan to bring the coronavirus pandemic under control. So Professor Sirleaf, I wonder if you could speak to us a bit about what is this plan exactly, the Biden-Harris plan, and what do you see as the likely consequences over the coming months of a transition to this plan? And as part of that, two questions that I'm thinking a lot about is what kind of legal issues do you think are likely to arise in response to any changes implemented? And will the US rejoin the World Health Organization? And if so, what is the relevance of that to the Biden-Harris plan?
Sure. So one of the things that's been announced already as of Monday, I believe President-elect Joe Biden announced members of his coronavirus task force. And what was striking about that is that it's made up entirely of doctors and health experts, which signals potentially the incoming administration's intent to seek a more science-based approach to bringing the pandemic under control. And they, as you alluded to in your question, have also released a detailed 7-point plan to combat the coronavirus pandemic, which includes increasing access to regular, reliable, and free testing through doubling the number of drive-through testing sites and using a stand-up pandemic testing board or setting it up, something akin to what Roosevelt set up, a war production board to produce tanks and other things like that. So doing the same thing, but doing that for test and the creation of tests. In addition, the incoming administration has signaled that they would like to fully make use of the Defense Production Act and ramp up production of masks, face shields, and other personal protective equipment, and to make sure that there is enough stockpiles of these things, and that this should be used to go towards populations that have been disproportionately impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, and to try to support states and local governments, particularly around budget shortfalls that we'll likely see with respect to schools, and giving schools additional resources so that they can adapt to COVID-19 and sort of the new normal of teaching in a pandemic. Significant legal issues will likely arise around ensuring the equitable distribution of treatments and vaccines. The plan includes a commitment to a $25 billion manufacturing and distribution plan of a vaccine to be distributed in the US that's cost-free, and ensuring that this is done on an equitable basis and not only limited to the well-to-do. There's also inbuilt in the plan an indication of an intent to protect older Americans and those that have been more at high risk and vulnerable to COVID-19. And this includes the creation of COVID-19 Racial and Ethnic Disparities Task Force, which Vice President-elect Harris recommended, that would provide oversight on what should be done with respect to providing recommendations to alleviate disparities in public health that are disproportionately impacting racial groups. And then, as you mentioned, doing a number of things internationally to try to rebuild the role that the US has historically played in terms of global health. And that includes reestablishing the White House National Security Council Directorate on Global Health Security and Biodefense that the Obama and Biden administration had. That also includes restoring the relationship with the World Health Organization. So joining that and rejoining that, because the Trump administration has indicated that it is planning to leave. That departure would not be effective until 2021, July 6, 2021. So if the President-elect Biden and Harris administration decide to reverse that decision, that would be significant because it would help not only with the funding of the current, so the World Health Organization, of course, while not perfect, is responsible for coordinating the global response to the COVID-19 pandemic and re-signaling our commitment or the United States commitment to join that institution and to coordinate efforts internationally towards tackling this disease would be a fantastic thing. In part also to this, the Trump administration has not been part of the global effort to try to find a vaccine. So even if there is a hint that the incoming Biden-Harris administration is willing to take part in the global efforts to distribute equitably the vaccine, that would be something that would be significant. And the US has a significant role financially and otherwise that it plays in global health. It has one of the biggest, gives one of the biggest voluntary contributions to the World Health budget. And of course, the World Health Organization does more than just deal with, outbreak and crisis response. It deals with a number of things implicating health. And what we've seen with the coronavirus is that, we're not able to wall ourselves off from threats and diseases that arise elsewhere. And so we are only as strong really as the weakest of us, and that's globally and nationally. And so I think what might happen at least is that there's a renewed commitment to engaging in capacity building, international cooperation, and a recognition of sort of the fact that we are tied in through globalization and through other things and exposed in ways in which require us to cooperate with other countries towards ending the pandemic. The pandemic, it can't really be resolved through sort of a whack-a-mole fashion. It has to be a systemic and holistic approach to dealing with this particular threat. Certainly a legal challenge that will come is the Biden-Harris administration has indicated that they want to implement a national mask mandate that they want every governor to make mandatory in their state. And we've already seen the backlash and protests that have come prior to the election with respect to mask mandates. Of course, public health experts agree that tens of thousands of lives can be saved if people wear masks. And so the President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris have indicated that they plan to try to make and encourage people to wear masks outside of their, when they encounter people outside of their households. And that's certainly going to be an area of controversy and legal disputes. So I'll stop there and in the interest of time.
Terrific, thank you. So staying on the theme of the re-engagement of the US in bodies such as the World Health Organization, Professor Chibundu, can I ask you, President-elect Biden has really signaled that one of his major moves is likely to be a return of the United States to bodies such as the World Trade Organization and the World Health Organization, as well as a re-engagement in multilateral treaty regimes, most prominently the Paris Climate Agreement, but also other regimes such as the so-called Iran nuclear deal. I wonder if you could just offer some reflections on what you think the likely consequences will be of this shift in policy and how it fits into longer trends in US policy towards international institutions.
Right. So if there's a distinctive feature of the Trump administration, it is the wholesale distrust of institutions and indeed countries outside of the United States. That runs really up against a long and quite rich history of US involvement in the international arena. If you really think about international institutions today, they are actually products of preferences that the US had, preferences for a particular world order, a liberal world order. As Peter just pointed out, the administration has withdrawn from a lot of those. And not only has it withdrawn from multilateral institutions, but it has tended to renegotiate quite a few of them. And many people ask for what purpose and towards what end. There have been, it's fair to say, there have always been a tendency in some administrations, the Reagan administration comes to mind in particular, to assert that the US is getting a whole lot less from international institutions than it is putting in. And that may very well be true. But what's understanding is that that was the price the US was willing to pay in the post-World War II order. Many people, not just Americans, but Europeans and others, believe that World War II would not have come about if the US had not avoided participating in the League of Nations. So in a way, the creation of international institutions are intended as preventive to bring about, at least to prevent war. And a lot of the negotiations have gone into that. The current or the outgoing administration seems not to be particularly bothered about those. And what would the Biden administration do? Well, what it says it will do is essentially to return to those practices that preceded the Trump administration. Admittedly, it wasn't utterly consistent, but by and large, all aspects or all elements of US domestic groups, policy groups, tended to agree on the need for international organizations, and indeed worked hard. That cut across party lines, it cut across regions, and my guess is Biden's administration will have very little difficulty in convincing a lot of the decision makers, policy makers in the United States to go along with the return of the US to these institutions. And it is perhaps, I mean, one concession one ought to make is that perhaps the withdrawal from many of these institutions by the Trump administration suggests to future policymakers how they might better negotiate the terms on which the US participates in them. But in either event, I think there's a wholesale support, at least among the intelligentsia, the elite in the United States for these organizations.
Terrific, thank you. So before we come to the last set of questions I have, it appears our chat function is not functioning. So if you do have a question you'd like to raise for the speakers, please use the raise hand function and I'll be able to call on you directly to ask any questions. But just while people are thinking of their questions, let me just come with the last round to each of you more briefly, given the time we have left. In terms of the obstacles and challenges that each of you see lying ahead for the Biden administration in these three areas. So Professor Goldberg, what are the major obstacles to the agenda you outlined for us? How much will control of the Senate, for example, be a factor in terms of the ability of the Biden administration to implement legislatively its tax agenda? I think you're muted there. Yeah.
No longer. Well, if the Republicans control the Senate and do so again in the next congressional election, I see stalemate on these changes. Unless some leaders emerge in Congress who want to get to a deal, and those things are possible. From the Republican side, I would not anticipate much movement unless the mood of their constituents appears to demand it, because the easy tax situation we now have is likely to stimulate the economy back to life after the pandemic clears, which I hope and expect it will. The sooner the better. I'm getting a little tired of staying home and not meeting my classes in person, but only via technology. Most of the Trump stimulus and ease up on the wealthy and high income tax provisions sunset at the end of 2025, as I mentioned before. That means that as time goes on, there'll be more incentive for the Republicans to reach a deal, unless, of course, moods or conditions change in the country. And who can predict that this far in advance? I mean, who would have predicted a pandemic? I would love to see a consumption tax replace the income tax at some time, as I've written in my Oxford Press book, The Death of the Income Tax. But advocating based on intellectual thought and analysis and predicting based on politics and tea leaves are two different games. And that is the case, even though much or perhaps most of the industrial world has gone to a VAT form of consumption tax as the major source of its tax revenue. And in my view, we are competitively disadvantaged in world trade by our continued reliance on an income tax, particularly a business income tax, as our major source of revenue. So time will tell. I can't predict how Congress is going to behave, not tomorrow, not next year, not the year after, beyond me.
Okay, thank you. So Professor Sirleaf, the same question to you. Much of your current work is really seeking to raise the visibility of questions of race and racial justice, not just in terms of the pandemic, but also on questions of national security. And I know you've been moderating this terrific symposium, Racing National Security, which I believe will soon be a book that you're editing for Oxford. So on the basis of your current work, what do you see as the major obstacles and challenges that lie ahead for Biden? I think you're muted there, Matiangai.
Sorry. So yeah, I mean, I think one of the challenges for any administration, and certainly President-elect Biden's administration is dealing with issues of racial justice, which have have been at the center of the founding of this country and continue to impact things today. And so we've seen what's been called sort of the twin pandemics, really, the COVID-19 pandemic, and then also the pandemic of just structural racism, and the ways in which this has been illuminated over the summer, but even more so, where it seems as if we are at a point of some real racial reckoning in terms of law and policy making, and in terms of the uprising that has been ongoing in response to the killing of Black people in situations of either excessive force or the like by police. And so what does that mean for the incoming administration? What does that mean for thinking about issues of national security writ large? The Racing National Security Symposium that you referenced sought to expand our conception of what national security consists of. And so traditionally, conventionally, national security is really just about sort of military security, maybe economic security, and then increasingly now health security, given the threat of the pandemic. And so where have questions of racial justice fallen? They've usually fallen to the wayside in thinking about national security and what it means to be secure. And the series in the book project is really seeking to render visible the ways in which failing to address issues of racial justice actually undermines the security of the state and the security of the communities themselves, and reconceptualizing and thinking about security for Black people and other communities of color in this country is something that is of fundamental importance. And the pandemic, I think, just reiterates the importance of that, because we've seen the disproportionate impact that the COVID-19 disease has had on communities of color. And we know that that's not because of innate differences. We know that that's because of structural inequality and structural racism, which means that Black and brown people are more likely to be essential workers in this pandemic. They're more likely to be in public facing jobs. They're less likely to have economic security. They are more likely to have exposure through being in dense public transportation, in housing that's overcrowded, in insecure sort of health because of lack of access to health, and also discrimination when interfacing with public health institutions, as well as not having sort of structural things in place domestically along the lines of paid sick leave and other things which expose them to greater risk of COVID-19. And so that dynamic of vulnerability domestically is also witnessed internationally when we think about those who live in the global South and the risk that they face to the coronavirus disease, and thinking through how those communities will be able to access vaccines and treatments from COVID-19, and what sort of a racially just distribution of vaccines and treatments would mean, taking into account the history of structural inequality and the history of racial subordination in this country, but also just globally, is something that is a pressing and dire concern that I think the pandemic has brought to the fore. And so I'll stop there in the interest of time. I could go on, but I'll stop.
Great, thank you. Thank you. So Professor Chibundu, really a huge question to you, but maybe you could offer some reflections. Again, obstacles and challenges to US foreign policy moving forward, and particularly on the issue of bilateral relations. What do you think lies in the future in terms of re-engagement with the EU, with China, with different parts of the world, such as Africa and Latin America?
Right. I'm going to use a nursery rhyme to answer the question. Humpty Dumpty sat on the wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. All the king's men and horses could not put Humpty Dumpty together again. I think that the fact is that as much as we all would like pre-2016 to recur, it's not going to, for a variety of reasons. In fact, to be accurate, the US was already moving away from the center of the world, which it had held for 60 years. And that's a lot of time in international politics and international relations to be at the top. So the fact is that much of the world have learned to do without the US, or at least to do with less of the US. So as much as Biden, the Biden administration might want to return us to the Clinton administration and the notion that the US is an indispensable nation, I'm skeptical that there will be such a return. China is certainly a very serious threat. I think, frankly, I think less in terms of military or defense type issues than in economic issues. I found fascinating a lot of the articles in the media here that criticizes China's engagement with the rest of the world on purportedly by lending them a lot of money. Now, that was exactly the problem that we in the West faced in the 1980s. The terms on which those loans are made will make a difference. So with regard to the friends who are closer, say Canada, for example, or Mexico, it might be easier. Memories might be very short. The EU is beginning to assert itself just as China is. And I am skeptical that, notwithstanding what previously the transatlantic trade negotiations that were going on, that you're going to have them. Now, there will be treaties, okay, there will be agreements, but they're not going to be, I think, as sweeping as the ones that had preceded. So the world is being reshaped, and we have to participate in that reshaping of the world.
Terrific. Thank you very much. Well, we're coming up on 7, but we do have, I think, time for just one question from Ravi, if you'd like to ask your question.
Thank you. It's great to see some of my former professors here. Real quick, in the interest of time, when I was at the University of Maryland, much of the security international paradigm and the legal issues around it were focused on post 9/11 and the counterterrorism world, and sort of the Obama administration had its own views on that. To what extent do you believe that the Biden-Harris administration will re-engage on both a policy and legal paradigm consistent with what the Obama administration did with sort of international relations and national security, or, as Professor Chibundu has articulated, systemic changes are such where it will not be akin to that, it will be something very unique to itself? Thank you very much.
So Professor Chibundu, maybe you could have the last word on that issue.
Hi. So here's, I doubt very much, I mean, there'll be no doubt that the Biden administration would want to return to the policies of the Obama administration. But the Obama administration did not always have a consistent policy. Russia is a classic example. The policy that the US had between 2008 and 2012 was fundamentally different from the policies it had between 2014 and 2016. So I think that there will be attempts, but as I just indicated, I'm doubtful that the results will be anywhere approximating what existed prior to the Trump administration.
Terrific. Well, unfortunately, our time is up. So please join me all virtually in thanking our 3 speakers this evening, and thank you to everyone for joining us for this conversation. I guess time will tell what the future holds. So thank you very much to everybody.